The forbidden blade and the human who didn't know better. The battlefield was silent. Smoke curled in the air, rising from burning wreckage. Bodies of alien warriors lay scattered across the cracked ground, their weapons broken beside them. The war had been brutal, and now it was over. Jason Walker stepped carefully over the debris, his boots crunching against shattered metal. He was just a human, one of the many soldiers hired to fight in this war. But he was still alive, which was more than he could say for most. His heart pounded as he scanned the battlefield. The enemy ships had retreated, leaving only ruins behind. The air was thick with the scent of blood and fire. He wiped sweat from his forehead and sighed. Time to find something useful before heading back. Then he saw it. A sword. It was not just any sword. It lay on the ground, half buried in dust, glowing faintly under the setting sun. Its black blade shimmered, its edges razor-sharp. Strange markings ran along its surface, pulsing like a heartbeat. Jason frowned. A sword. In a world of plasma rifles and energy cannons. He had seen many weapons, but nothing like this. Something about it felt wrong. Yet, he couldn't look away. Curious, he reached down and wrapped his fingers around the hilt. The moment his skin touched it, the world shifted. A sharp wind howled around him. The air crackled with unseen energy. Jason's breath caught in his throat as the sword hummed in his grip, sending a pulse of warmth through his arm. It was like it was alive. He staggered back, gripping it tightly. The ground beneath him vibrated. His mind screamed at him to drop it, but his body refused. The blade felt right in his hands, as if it had been waiting for him. Then he heard the whispers. Unworthy. Impossible. Jason turned sharply. Shadows moved in the distance. Figures stepped out from behind the wreckage, their glowing eyes locked onto him. Aliens. At least a dozen of them. Tall, armored, their weapons drawn. Their skin was dark blue, their faces unreadable. But their eyes burned with something Jason recognized immediately. Fear. One of them, a warrior with golden markings on his chest, took a cautious step forward. Human. Drop the blade. His voice was sharp, commanding. You don't know what you have done. Jason's grip tightened. His heart pounded. His instincts screamed at him. This was bad. Why? He asked, trying to sound calm. The alien didn't answer. Instead, he pointed his weapon at Jason. So did the others. I said, drop it. Now. Jason's eyes flicked to the sword. It still hummed in his hand like a living thing. His gut told him that giving it up would not save him. These warriors weren't just afraid of the blade. They were afraid of him holding it. And that made no sense. He was just a man. He took a slow step backward. The golden-marked alien growled. You do not understand. That weapon belongs to our queen. It has not been touched for centuries. No one. He stopped. His eyes widened as he looked at the sword again. It accepted you. His voice was barely a whisper. Jason had no idea what that meant, but it didn't sound good. The other aliens exchanged glances. Their fear was turning into something else. Anger. Hatred. Jason's pulse raced. He had to get out of here. Then the Golden Warrior's expression hardened. Kill him. The world exploded into motion. Jason ducked as an energy blast shot past his head. He spun, the sword moving on its own. He didn't know how, but it pulled him, guiding his movements. An alien lunged at him. Jason reacted instinctively. He swung the blade. The black metal sliced through armor like paper. The warrior fell, gasping in shock. The others hesitated. Jason panted, looking down at the sword in his grip. What kind of weapon was this? He didn't have time to think. Another alien attacked. Jason dodged, his body moving faster than ever before. The blade flashed, cutting through his enemy's weapon with ease. More warriors charged. Jason ran. His heart pounded as he sprinted toward the wreckage, leaping over fallen debris. He had to escape. But the aliens weren't giving up. "Do not let him leave," someone shouted. Shots blasted past him. Jason dove behind a crashed ship, gasping for breath. His fingers clenched around the hilt of the sword. It was still humming. "What the hell did I just steal?" he muttered. In the distance, he heard something even worse. A deep, echoing sound, like metal scraping against metal. The aliens suddenly froze. Their faces paled. Jason turned, following their terrified stares. A massive black ship hovered in the sky above them. Its surface gleamed like liquid shadow. Strange symbols burned across its hull. Jason didn't know much about alien politics, but he understood one thing. Whoever was inside that ship was not here for peace. And then, a single voice echoed from the ship's speakers, cold and sharp like a blade itself. "The human who touched my weapon. Bring him to me." Jason's blood turned to ice. The Queen had arrived. The Queen's wrath, and the chase begins. The ship was silent. Too silent. It hovered above the battlefield like a giant black predator, watching, waiting. Jason felt the weight of the sword in his grip, its eerie hum still vibrating through his bones. Around him, the aliens stood frozen, their expressions a mix of fear and disbelief. Even the warriors who had just tried to kill him moments ago now hesitated. Then, the silence broke. A single beam of dark energy shot down from the ship, slamming into the ground just meters away. The shockwave knocked Jason off his feet, his ears ringing from the force. Dust and debris filled the air. Then, she stepped out. At first, all he saw was a silhouette. A tall, armored figure emerging from the smoke. Her cloak billowed behind her like liquid shadow. Her presence was heavy, suffocating. The very air around her seemed to tremble. The alien queen. Jason had never seen her before, but he knew exactly who she was. Everyone did. She wasn't just a ruler. She was a legend. The kind mothers warned their children about. The kind that made even battle-hardened warriors bow in silence. And yet she wasn't looking at them. Her piercing golden eyes locked onto him. Jason swallowed hard. His instincts screamed at him to run, but his body wouldn't move. Then she spoke. "Give me my blade." Her voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It cut through the chaos like a blade through flesh. Cold, precise, absolute. Jason's fingers tightened around the sword's hilt. It didn't let go. His heart pounded. Why? Why wouldn't it let go? The Queen's eyes flickered with something unreadable. Then, without a word, she raised her hand. The air cracked. Jason barely had time to react before an invisible force slammed into him. His body lifted off the ground and was thrown backward like a ragdoll, crashing into a broken piece of metal. Pain exploded in his ribs. He gasped for air, his vision blurring. The Queen took a slow step forward. The other aliens stayed behind, unmoving. This was her fight. Jason groaned, pushing himself up, his mind screaming in protest. But the moment he lifted the sword, the Queen's eyes narrowed. Then she moved. She didn't walk. She glided. In a blink, she was in front of him. Her hand shot out. Jason reacted without thinking. He raised the sword. And the impossible happened. The blade blocked her attack. A burst of energy exploded between them, sending out a shockwave that shook the battlefield. The aliens watching gasped. The Queen staggered. For the first time in her reign, her own weapon had denied her. Jason, wide-eyed, stared at her. What the hell just happened? The Queen's fingers twitched. A flicker of raw, unfiltered fury crossed her face. Then she lunged. Jason barely managed to roll away as her fist slammed into the ground where he had been standing. The impact left a crater. He scrambled to his feet, his instincts screaming run. He didn't need to be told twice. Jason bolted. Behind him, the Queen didn't give chase. She didn't need to. She lifted her hand. The ground beneath Jason exploded. Chunks of metal and debris rained around him as he leaped over the wreckage, his heart hammering. She was toying with him. No, worse. She was testing him. The sword pulsed in his grip, almost as if guiding him. Every step, every turn, it felt like it was helping him escape. Why? Why had it chosen him? Jason had no answers, but he had one mission now: survive. He ducked behind a burning vehicle just as another blast of energy nearly incinerated him. He had to think, had to move. But then, everything stopped. The Queen had stopped moving. The battlefield was silent again. Jason turned his head and felt his stomach drop. A second ship was approaching. It was not hers. It belonged to the rebels. And they had just witnessed everything. Jason wasn't sure what was worse, being hunted by the Queen, or what the rebels would do to him if they got to him first. Either way, he was running out of time. The Queen finally faces the human. Jason was running. Not just from the Queen. Not just from her warriors. But from something bigger than himself. The sky rumbled as the rebel ship descended, its engines howling like a wounded beast. Dust and fire swirled around him. Jason had no idea who these rebels were, but one thing was clear: they weren't here to save him. The Queen's forces turned their heads toward the approaching ship, their attention split for the first time. This was his chance. Jason gritted his teeth, clutching the cursed sword in his grip. He had no idea where he was running, just away. His lungs burned, his legs ached, but he didn't stop. Then, a shadow moved in front of him. His heart skipped. He skidded to a stop, nearly tripping over his own feet. She was there, the Queen. She had moved faster than the eye could follow. 1 second, she was standing by her ship. The next, she was blocking his only escape. Jason inhaled sharply. Her cloak danced in the wind, her golden eyes glowing in the fading sunlight. She wasn't even breathing hard, like she hadn't even moved at all. His fingers tightened on the hilt of the sword. The Queen took a step forward. Enough. Her voice was ice. Not angry, not loud, just final. Jason's pulse roared in his ears. He had one chance. He lifted the blade, gripping it with both hands. The Queen's expression didn't change. "You think you can fight me?" she asked. Jason didn't answer. He couldn't. The blade in his hands was vibrating, whispering in a language he couldn't understand. The Queen studied him, her gaze scanning every inch of his face. Then she did something unexpected. She smiled. Not a kind smile. Not a warm one. A knowing smile, like she had already won. Jason barely had time to react before she vanished. His instincts screamed. He swung the sword. Too slow. A cold hand gripped his throat. His breath caught as his feet left the ground. The Queen had moved behind him in an instant, her grip like iron. He struggled, gasping, kicking, but she held him up like he weighed nothing. "You are a fool, human." Her voice was a whisper against his ear. Dangerous. Deadly. Jason's fingers clawed at her grip. But then, the sword reacted. A sudden, violent pulse shot through the blade. Jason felt it burn in his grip, then saw something impossible. The Queen flinched, only for a fraction of a second. Barely visible, but it was enough. Jason swung the sword. A blinding arc of black energy tore through the air. The Queen let go, dodging just in time, her feet skidding against the dirt. A single strand of her dark hair drifted to the ground. Cut. The aliens watching gasped. Jason landed hard, coughing as he sucked in air. His vision blurred, his whole body screaming in pain. But then he looked up. The Queen wasn't attacking. She stood there, staring at her own hand. For the first time in her long reign, her own weapon had drawn against her, and she didn't know why. Jason's breathing was ragged, his hands shaking, but he forced himself to stand. The Queen's golden eyes lifted to meet his. Then she spoke. "What are you?" Jason swallowed. He had no answer. But before he could even try to respond, the rebels attacked. The Queen's dilemma: kill him or protect him. The first explosion tore through the battlefield like a shockwave from the gods. Jason barely had time to react before the force knocked him off his feet. He hit the ground hard, rolling across the dirt, his fingers still locked around the cursed sword. Above him, the sky burned. The rebels had arrived. Their ships descended like vultures, engines screaming, plasma cannons unloading fire upon the Queen's forces. Alien warriors scrambled for cover as the battlefield turned into chaos. And in the middle of it all, the Queen stood perfectly still. Jason, gasping for breath, pushed himself onto his knees. His body ached, his vision blurred, but his eyes were locked on her. She wasn't moving. She wasn't even looking at the battle. She was staring at him, the same unreadable expression on her face, the same golden eyes, watching, thinking. And then the impossible happened. She turned away from him. Jason's breath hitched. What? The Queen, the ruthless, feared ruler of the Xendari Empire, had him in her grasp. She had every reason to kill him. Her blade, her honor, her empire's traditions. And yet she turned away. He didn't understand. Then, a rebel gunship locked onto her position. Jason saw it before she did. The ship's cannons glowed, locking their aim. A few seconds later, they would fire and he didn't think. He moved. Without knowing why, without questioning the insanity of it, Jason threw himself forward. His boots hit the ground hard as he sprinted toward the Queen. The sword in his grip reacted instantly, humming with a strange energy. And just as the gunship fired, Jason leaped. The moment felt impossible. The air cracked. Time slowed. He swung the sword in an arc above his head, and the blast split apart. The plasma shot diverted midair, breaking into two streaks of harmless light that crashed into the ground on either side of them. Silence. For a heartbeat, the battle stopped. Everyone had seen it. Jason, panting, lowered the sword. What had he just done? The Queen turned her head slowly. She stared at him, not with anger, not with fury, with realization. The sword had not just chosen him. It had protected her. The battlefield roared back to life. The rebels charged, their war cries shaking the air. The Queen's forces regrouped, blades igniting, ready to fight. Jason barely had time to breathe before a squad of rebels rushed toward them. He braced for the worst. He was just a human. He couldn't take on an army. Then he felt it. A presence beside him. A shadow moving in perfect sync. He turned his head. The Queen was standing at his side. For the first time, they weren't enemies. She raised her hand, and her warriors responded instantly. Jason gritted his teeth, gripping the sword tighter. His mind was still screaming at him to run, but his body refused to step back. And when the rebels reached them, he fought beside her. Blades clashed. Sparks flew. Jason moved on instinct, every attack flowing through him like second nature. He wasn't the best fighter. He wasn't even close, but the sword made him one. He ducked, dodged, slashed, each movement guided by something not his own. And through it all, the Queen watched him, not like a predator anymore, not like an enemy, like she was seeing something new. The battle raged on, but Jason knew something had changed. And whatever came next, it would change the fate of the entire empire. The duel that shakes the galaxy. The battlefield was in ruins. Smoke curled from shattered warships, and the bodies of fallen warriors lay strewn across the scorched earth. The rebels had retreated, but the damage had been done. The Queen's forces were weakened. The empire was shaken. And Jason Walker stood at the center of it all. He could feel the weight of 100 alien eyes on him, some with hatred, some with disbelief, and some with something far worse. Fear, not of him, of what the blade had done. Jason had no idea what had happened in the battle. The sword had moved like a living thing, guiding his strikes, keeping him alive, protecting the queen. He should have been dead. Instead, he had survived, and that was unacceptable. The human is unworthy. He should not be allowed to wield the sacred blade. The voice came from the crowd. A tall Xendari warrior stepped forward, his dark armor reflecting the burning sky. General Zalvin, a warlord, a legend in his own right. He looked at Jason like he was nothing. Jason, still catching his breath, barely had time to react before the general turned to the queen. "This is a disgrace." His voice was cold, sharp. "No outsider has ever touched the queen's weapon and lived. He is an insult to our traditions. He must be executed." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the warriors. The Xendari were watching their queen now, waiting for her to pass judgment. Jason tensed, gripping the sword tighter. He didn't understand their customs, their laws, but he understood danger. And right now, he was surrounded by it. The queen was silent. She stood at the edge of the ruined battlefield, watching Jason with those unreadable golden eyes. He couldn't tell what she was thinking. Then she turned to Xalvin. Her voice was quiet. "You challenge his right to wield the blade." Xalvin's eyes burned. "Of course. He is unworthy." A pause. Then the queen's lips curled into something that was not quite a smile. "Then prove it." Silence. Jason's stomach dropped. Oh no. The queen took a step forward, her gaze locking onto him like a blade pressed against his throat. "By our laws, only strength decides who is worthy. If you wish to take the sword from him, you must earn it." She turned to the gathered warriors. "The human will fight." Jason's mind reeled. "Wait, what?" The queen ignored him. She raised her chin. "A sacred duel. If he loses, the blade will reject him. If he dies, it was never meant to be his. If he wins..." Her golden eyes flickered. "Then fate has already chosen." Xalvin grinned. Jason swore. The arena. The Xendari did not waste time. Within the hour, a dueling circle had been cleared in the ruins of the battlefield. Hundreds of warriors gathered to watch. Jason stood in the center, sweat dripping down his back. Across from him, Xalvin stood motionless. His massive form cast a shadow in the dust. He was stronger, faster, a trained warrior with years of battle experience. Jason, just a human holding a cursed sword. The moment the duel was declared, he knew how this would end. He was going to die. The queen stood at the edge of the circle, her expression unreadable. Jason looked at her once. "You really expect me to fight him?" She did not answer. The sword in Jason's grip hummed. Xalvin took a step forward. His armor shifted as he reached for his own weapon, a massive double-bladed spear that crackled with energy. "I will make this quick, human." His voice was cold. Jason swallowed. "I'd appreciate that." The queen raised her hand. The crowd fell silent. "Then, begin." Xalvin moved like a beast unleashed. His spear slashed through the air, aimed directly for Jason's throat. Jason barely ducked in time. The spear sliced past his head, the heat of it burning against his skin. He had no time to breathe. Xalvin attacked again. Jason raised his sword and blocked. The air cracked. The force of the impact nearly shattered his bones. The blade absorbed the blow, but the sheer strength behind it sent Jason skidding backward. He coughed, his arms screaming in pain. Xalvin didn't stop. Another attack. Another block. Another impact that rattled Jason to his core. He was losing. Every time he blocked, his arms weakened. Every strike Xalvin delivered pushed him closer to the ground. The sword was helping him, but it wasn't enough. Then, Xalvin swung low. Jason tried to dodge, but too late. The spear slammed into his ribs. A blast of pain shot through his body as he crashed to the ground, gasping. His vision blurred. Xalvin stood over him, triumphant. The crowd roared. Jason's fingers twitched. He could feel the blade still humming, but it was slipping from his grip. Zalvin raised his spear for the final blow. Jason closed his eyes. Then, something changed. The air shifted. Jason's heartbeat slowed. He felt something pulling him, a force guiding him. He opened his eyes, and before Zalvin could strike, Jason moved. Not like a soldier, not like a human, like something else. The sword pulsed, and Jason twisted, faster than he ever had before. His blade met Zalvin's spear and shattered it. The impact sent Zalvin flying backward. He hit the ground hard, his broken weapon clattering beside him. Silence. Jason stood there, panting. His sword glowed. Zalvin did not rise. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then, the queen stepped forward. She looked at Zalvin's fallen form, then at Jason. Then, at the blade in his hands. A long, heavy silence followed. Then she spoke. Soft, but absolute. The sword has chosen. The crowd knelt, and Jason Walker, the human who should have died, realized something terrifying. He had just won the right to wield the queen's blade. The betrayal and the final battle. The weight of the blade in Jason's hands felt different. It was no longer just a weapon. It had become a part of him, an extension of his will. His body moved with unnatural ease, his senses sharp and clear. His every action was guided by the sword, like he was no longer a human, but something more. The crowd of alien warriors parted in silence as the queen approached. Her golden eyes never left him. Her expression remained unreadable, but there was something in her gaze, a flicker of respect, perhaps, or maybe just curiosity. Jason wasn't sure. He didn't know how to feel anymore. He had just defeated a warlord in front of an empire. And now, the queen stepped closer. You have earned your place among us. Her voice was quiet, but the words hit Jason like a thunderclap. He swallowed. What does that mean? It means you are no longer just a human. She said it without emotion, but Jason could hear the weight of the words. You are the bearer of the blade of the queen. The power of the Xendari is now in your hands. Jason stepped back. He wasn't sure if he should feel honored or terrified. The entire empire was watching him now. The queen's blade had never chosen a human before. But before he could respond, the ground shook. The sky above darkened. A low, rumbling sound echoed through the air. Jason looked up, and his heart sank. Another fleet, a much larger one. The rebel forces had returned. The queen's eyes narrowed. It is time. Jason glanced at her, then back at the fleet that loomed over them. The battle was far from over. But something in the queen's demeanor had changed. She was no longer just the ruthless ruler. Now she was a warrior preparing for war. Her voice was cold, but calm. The rebels seek to destroy everything we have built. They do not understand the power of the blade. They do not understand the consequences of challenging our empire. Jason's grip tightened around the sword. The power humming through him felt more intense now, more dangerous. They will learn, the queen continued, her eyes flashing. But not from me. From you. Jason blinked. What? The queen turned toward the rising ships. You will lead our forces. Jason's stomach dropped. Lead? He had no army. He was just one person with a sword he barely understood. But the queen didn't wait for him to speak. She stepped toward the battlefield, her warriors at her side. Either you fight for us, or you die. Her words were simple, but deadly. Choose wisely, human. The betrayal. It wasn't long before Jason realized the queen's power wasn't just in her weapon. It was in her control. Her warriors followed her without question. They trusted her. They feared her. And Jason. He was an outsider, a human who had just proven himself in battle. But he wasn't one of them. As the battle began, Jason found himself on the front lines, wielding the sword with an authority he had never felt before. The rebels attacked in waves, their ships descending with precision. But Jason, his body guided by the sword, felt almost unstoppable. He fought with the Queen's forces, cutting down enemies left and right. But something felt off. The power that surged through him felt too much. The sword whispered in his mind. Control. Power. Conquer. This was not the path he wanted. But the more he fought, the more the sword pulled him into the battle. Every swing felt like it wasn't his choice. Every strike felt like it was coming from somewhere else. And in the chaos, Jason finally understood. This power had a cost. As the rebels fell back, something shattered inside the Queen's ranks. A figure stepped out from the shadows. It was Calvin, the warlord he had defeated. But now he was wearing a strange armor, dark and shimmering with a strange energy. His eyes glowed with a menacing red light. And behind him, 100 warriors who had once fought for the Queen. They were betraying her. It's time for a new ruler. The Xalvan's voice was low, cold. The blade has chosen the wrong leader. The power of the Tsendari belongs to those who know how to control it. Jason's heart pounded in his chest. The sword in his hands pulsed with dark energy. He looked at the Queen, who stood beside him, watching with narrowed eyes. For the first time, she looked unsure. Xalvan's voice boomed again. You are not worthy of the blade, human. Give it to me. The Queen turned to Jason. Her golden eyes burned with an emotion he couldn't place. Desperation. Don't trust him, Jason. Her voice was sharp, but she was speaking to him like she had never spoken before. Xalvan grinned, and the betrayal became clear. The rebels had joined forces with the warlord who once swore loyalty to the Queen. The battle had shifted. The Queen's empire was on the edge of collapse. Jason had to decide, stand by the Queen or betray everything he had fought for. He looked at the Queen one last time, his grip tightening on the sword. And then, he made his choice. The Queen's blade has a new legend. The air was thick with tension. The battlefield had become a place of impossible choices and shifting allegiances. Jason could feel the weight of the sword in his hand, its power more alive than ever. It was no longer a mere tool. It was an entity, a force that bent the world to its will. And Jason was its vessel. Before him stood the Rebel Alliance, now united under Xalvan's banner. Behind him, the Queen's once mighty empire was crumbling, its warriors divided and confused. Yet Jason, though still human, had done something unthinkable. He had wielded the blade in a way no one, not even the Queen, had ever anticipated. And now, everything was on the line. Xalvan smirked, his glowing red eyes fixed on Jason. You've played your part, human. But now, it's time to surrender the blade. It was never meant for your kind. His voice was cold, mocking. Jason didn't respond. His mind was spinning. What did this sword mean now? What was he truly becoming? The power within it was intoxicating, its pull undeniable. Would he lose himself to it? Or would he choose to break free? He looked at the Queen, standing a few steps behind him, her golden eyes narrowed. There was no warmth left in her gaze, just an intensity that spoke of years of bloodshed, of battles fought, and of an empire on the brink of collapse. She had never asked for his help, but now she needed him. You have no place here anymore, Jason, Xalvan sneered. This blade should have been mine from the beginning. Jason could feel the tension building. The Queen's warriors were still scattered, unsure of where to place their loyalty, and behind him, the rebel army was ready to strike, led by a traitor. But in the stillness of the moment, the blade responded. It whispered to Jason, like an ancient force that had waited eons for this very moment. It was no longer just a weapon, it was a legacy. He raised the blade, and the entire battlefield seemed to hold its breath. The rebel forces froze. Even Xalvan seemed to hesitate for a heartbeat, his confident sneer faltering. Then, Jason spoke. His voice was calm, steady, like it was carrying a weight much heavier than he was prepared for. "I don't care about your empire. I don't care about your rebellion." His eyes met the Queen's for the first time, and he saw something in them, a shift, a recognition. She was no longer just a ruler. She was a fellow warrior. He turned back to Xalvin, the sword glowing in his hand. "I care about something else." The ground shook beneath them as the sword's power surged, its energy crackling through the air like lightning. The battle was about to begin again. Xalvin let out a roar of fury and charge, his own dark armor gleaming with energy. He swung his weapon, a massive, jagged spear designed for destruction. But Jason didn't flinch. With a move born of instinct, he raised the Queen's blade, and the sword met the spear in a clash of fury. The force of the impact shattered the spear into 100 fragments, sending them scattering across the battlefield. The shockwave threw Jason back, but the sword stayed in his grip, as if it were part of him. Xalvin stumbled, shock written on his face. For the first time, he saw real fear. Jason advanced, step by step, his every motion guided by something deep and primal. He didn't need to think. The blade told him what to do. His every swing was perfect. His every strike was precise. The air around him hummed with energy. He was no longer just a human. He was the bearer of the Queen's blade, a force that would change the galaxy. Xalvin tried to rally, but Jason was faster, stronger. Each strike of the blade pushed him back. The rebel warlord's forces hesitated, unsure whether to fight or to run. The Queen stepped forward, her eyes locked on Jason. She had always been the one who commanded, always the one who led. But now, for the first time, she saw someone else leading. Him. Jason stood over Xalvin, the blade raised for the final strike. His mind was clear, his heart steady. This wasn't about loyalty, power, or revenge. This was about something greater, something unseen. He brought the blade down. Xalvin fell, his final breath escaping as the sword cleaved through his armor and his will. The battle was over. The battlefield went silent. And then, from the shadows of the ruined ships, the remaining rebel forces began to kneel. Not to Jason, but to the blade. Jason stood tall, breathing heavily. The sword still hummed in his hand, a constant presence that no longer felt like a burden, but a destiny. The Queen walked toward him, her expression unreadable. For the first time, she bowed her head, not to the Empire, not to the tradition, but to him. "The blade has chosen." Her voice was quiet, but it carried the weight of 1,000 lifetimes. "It was never meant to be mine. It was meant for you." Jason looked at the sword in his hand, the glow fading as the battle ended. He wasn't sure what this meant. He wasn't sure if he was ready. But one thing was clear. He had written his own legend now. And the universe would note his name. The Queen's blade had a new master, and it was a human.